Is the universe actually real? So I think most people alive in the world today probably have a kind of dualist view of the universe. On the one hand, obviously we acknowledge that there is a physical universe, there's a physical world around us, and we have physical bodies. We also have brains which are part of our physical bodies. But on the other hand, we have another set of experiences which we could say exist in the realm of mind. So we feel sadness or happiness, we feel emotions, we feel pain, despair, contentedness. These things belong to the realm of the mental or psychological, a part of the mind. And we have to somehow reconcile those two things. Now, a kind of Christian dualist perspective would say that, well, we are physical things, we're physical animals, but we have souls, and the mind is kind of a manifestation of the soul. And that was what many people believed, at least in the West, for probably many centuries. With the rise of science and the ever-increasing success of science, many people have been tempted to try to kind of drop the mind aspect of this duality. So we see the rise of materialism. In materialism, we acknowledge the reality of physical things. So we say that atoms are real, gravity is real, space is real, and so on. But mind or emotion, certainly souls, these are in some sense less real. So a common thing you'll hear from someone who is a materialist is that emotion is an illusion. Other people will say it's not an illusion, it's an emergent property of matter. But that's basically like saying it is matter when you come down to it, as far as I can see. It's hard to really extract any meaning from that, I would argue. Because, for example, a whirlwind is an emergent property of the atmosphere, certainly, or of air molecules. But that's still a physical thing. Whereas here we're saying that an entirely different category of thing, the mental or the psychological, is an emergent property of the physical. And that just seems pretty dubious to me. But anyway, let's take the materialist perspective very seriously just for the moment. And we're going to kind of steel man it and see where that leads us. So if you think about all the things you experience colours if your eyes are working okay, you can touch things, you can hear things if you're not deaf, and so on. Now all of these things combine to give us a feeling that we are moving around in a space. So I'm over here, you're over there somewhere, wherever you are. There's a lot of space between us and I can move around. So right now I'm sitting in my study. I could go into my living room, for example. I can move over there or go outside. But where does this feeling of existing in a space actually come from? Everything that we experience of the outside world, of the universe, actually comes to us through nerve impulses. And they don't carry taste or texture or colour or anything like that. They're just dry signals. In effect, your brain is in a jar, which we call the skull. And there are a bunch of essentially wires connected to that. And those wires, the nerves, transmit information to the brain. So if you smell a flower, for example, that kind of scent is not somehow transmitted bodily from the flower through the nerve to your brain. What's transmitted along the nerve is just a bunch of electrochemical impulses. It's not Morse code, but it might as well be. If you think of your brain as just receiving a load of different Morse code signals via different wires, well, that would seem to be a pretty good analogy for what actually is happening. Your brain then has to assemble from those impulses this sense of being in a space. So it creates this sense of space. And there's then a question about what is space in itself. So as you experience it, it's all assembled in your brain. But what actually exists of space itself? Now, the fact that your sense of space is assembled in your brain, along with things like your sense of colour, your sense of scents, of tastes, textures and so on, seems to me pretty well indisputable from a materialist perspective. If any further evidence were needed, consider what happens when you sleep. When you sleep, you dream. When you dream, you can find yourself in a world that seems completely real, that seems to be spacious. There is a space there that you're moving around in, but it's not real at all. That is assembled completely in your brain, and we all accept that, or most of us anyway. So you see that your brain can assemble a sense of space, even without any input from your nerves at all. Furthermore, there are some disorders that seem to disrupt or remove the sense of space. Oliver Sacks, in some of his books, the late neurologist, talks about hemispheric neglect, where people who've had a stroke quite commonly apparently will neglect one half of their world. So they'll shave one half of their face or just eat one half of what's on a plate in front of them, for example. And Sacks theorised that that was because they couldn't form a conception of the left half of their space, for example, or the right half, anymore. Part of their brain had been damaged that assembled that kind of side of space, and it wasn't working anymore, so they just couldn't form a conception of there being anything on the left-hand side, let's say. Now, I think we have to ask, what stops us from saying, okay, maybe there isn't any such thing as space. Maybe it's all in our minds. And you have to remember, what we call the brain is a physical object in this space that we're talking about. So, if your mind creates a sense of space, then the existence of the brain is called into question. And what stops us from saying that, well, maybe everything is in our mind and there is nothing that's real in itself? What stops us from saying that? Now, Descartes actually tackled this question. He tackled it in his famous book, Discourse on Method, which is the book where he says, I think, therefore I am. And he pointed out that you must exist because you're thinking. I know that I exist because I think. I would say better now in the age of computers, which some people argue can think. I would rather say in this day and age, I feel, therefore I am. Because it's really the fact that I feel that proves to me that I exist. I can't not exist, because then I wouldn't be here feeling stuff. And when it came to the question of the physical world, Descartes basically said, well, God wouldn't be so wicked as to deceive us about the existence of the physical world. That was his argument for why the physical world has to really exist. And I don't think all that many people today would accept that. Well, in the world as a whole, maybe there would be a lot of people that would accept that argument, but people of a more kind of scientific, rationalist mindset would want something else other than an appeal to God's goodness in this day and age. And really, the only argument that we actually have against everything being in our mind is, unfortunately, that the idea that everything is in our mind is just too horrible to contemplate. So it's actually extremely similar to Descartes' argument. We've just removed God from it, but we've said in effect that the universe can't possibly be that evil, which is really not any better. You think about it, that is the state of play. Why can't everything be in your mind? You know that when you dream at night, your brain makes up a world, a whole universe in fact, that isn't real. So how do you know the things you're experiencing now are real? You don't. You just don't want to accept the possibility that they might not be real. And there's a further element to this, because Christians have this thing called Pascal's wager, Pascal said, well, maybe God doesn't exist, but you're better off believing that he does, because if you get it wrong, you're going to go to hell. That's kind of paraphrasing a bit. But now, wouldn't we say the same thing, even those of us who aren't religious? We would say something very similar to that. I would say, maybe the universe doesn't really exist in itself, but I'm better off assuming it does, because if I assume it doesn't, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to mess my life up. I'm going to treat people as though they don't matter. I'm going to treat life and death as though it's an unimportant distinction, and this will have very negative consequences. So I'm better off assuming that the world is real, just in case it actually is real. So that's a kind of materialist version, really, if you think about it, of Pascal's wager. Now, I'm not dismissing this. I'm not saying you should assume that things aren't real. I'm just pointing out that we don't exactly have strong scientific evidence that the world exists. We just prefer to assume that it does, for various reasons, mainly having to do with the idea that it doesn't exist being too horrible, and the risk that we could get it wrong, and that might have terrible consequences. So let's assume that other people do exist, because if you think about it, you're probably not really bothered whether the physical world exists or not. What you're really bothered about is other people, or better said perhaps, other sentient beings, because you might have cats that you care about, or dogs, or other animals. And unless you're a psychopath, you're certainly not going to treat an animal as though it was an inanimate object. You're not going to torture a mouse for the fun of it, for example, because you think, well, a mouse probably has feelings and I don't want to hurt it unnecessarily. I would hope that most people who aren't psychopaths think like that. As for the actual rest of the physical world, I don't think it would really bother any of us, if you really think about it, if it somehow turned out that it wasn't real, as long as other sentient beings are real. That sunset wouldn't be any less beautiful if it was some kind of amazing creation of your mind than it is when you think it actually exists in itself, because the beauty has to be created in your mind anyway. What you're actually getting from that sunset are, as we've discussed, a set of dry signals, not unlike Morse code going down a bunch of wires. So in a sense, the sunset isn't real anyway. That beauty is something that you're kind of interpreting into the signals you're getting. So I don't think it would really bother anyone if the physical universe didn't exist, as long as other people were actually real. And that gives us some interesting challenges, because then the problem that we've set for ourselves is, can we come up with some sort of metaphysics where, okay, the physical universe might not be real, but at least other people have got to be real. And then I could say, okay, the physical universe, space, could be in my mind as long as it's also in other people's minds as well, and as long as they have their own separate minds. And here we have an interesting problem, because someone could live, let's say 100 years ago, and they could write a bunch of stuff down on a piece of paper. They could write down even their innermost thoughts and feelings. And then they die, and 100 years later I read what they've written on this piece of paper, and I'm going to acknowledge on the basis of that this person really existed. I don't know if what they wrote was factually true, but someone wrote that, I presume. I mean, artificial intelligence didn't even exist 100 years ago, so if I found something that's 100 years old and it's written in fluent English or whatever, then someone existed who wrote that. Now, those symbols on that piece of paper that I'm reading, they existed first in someone's mind. That person then died, and then 100 years later, those symbols have been transmitted into my mind. And the question is, where were those symbols in between that person dying and me reading it if space doesn't exist? We kind of need space, it seems, to act as a kind of data bank for information, a kind of central shared repository of information. Otherwise, how can we make sense of that situation? But we haven't yet discussed time. Now, if you think about it, think about your emotions. Forget about the things that you feel trigger them in the external world. Just think about how you actually feel in yourself. Those emotions take place in time. They don't take place in space. So yes, your brain is located in space, but this is something that we are kind of calling into question. We are saying maybe space, including the brain and everything else in it, is just another experience I'm having. And the experiences that you have, like for example the sensation of love, that doesn't exist at a location, unless you just associate the feeling with the location of your physical body. But if you don't do that, well, where is love? It isn't anywhere, but it does exist in time. So you're going to be feeling this sensation of love or whatever, let's say between 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock on Tuesday. Then maybe you stop thinking about whoever it is you love and you have some other emotion after that and before that. So emotions do take place in time. They just don't take place in space. And this seems to give a kind of reality to time that space doesn't have. In a sense, time seems more real than space. Even if you exist in an isolation chamber and you can't experience anything of the outside world, all your senses are somehow cut off, you still presumably experience time passing, even if your sense of time passing gets heavily distorted by the lack of external input. And similarly, although the nerve impulses that your brain receives do not contain space in any sense, that sense of space is fabricated in your brain, it does seem a bit like they contain time because they are transmitted to us sequentially in time, it would seem. And time is the real problem here, because if you were to discard the idea that time is real, then this problem of where does information reside in between one person dying and another person receiving that information, that problem goes away, because that's just an issue with time. We've got to deal with that period of time when this information wasn't in the mind of a person. So if you are willing to ditch the idea that time exists in itself, you could also ditch the idea that space exists in itself. Now, I'm not saying that we should do that. I'm just pointing this out as something that I find rather interesting. It's particularly interesting because these questions have come up in connection with the modern science of quantum mechanics, because there we're getting into various difficulties regarding space and perhaps time. For example, there's the interesting phenomenon of entanglement, whereby two particles that are separated, in theory, even by thousands of miles, although I don't think this has been tested over more than like 11 kilometers or something, they can influence each other seemingly instantaneously, so faster than the speed of light, although it has to be emphasized that no information can be transmitted via entanglement. But this phenomenon of entanglement seems to involve some kind of strange connection, some strange instantaneous connection between particles that are separated even by a considerable distance, which is very strange and certainly must make us wonder what's going on with space in that case. And there are other problems in quantum mechanics. For example, there's this thing where there's no real explanation for why quantum mechanics, the equations of it, don't seem to apply to objects at the ordinary scale. So they apply it seemingly to very tiny particles and even to atoms and molecules in some experiments, but they don't seem to apply well to ordinary sized objects. And these equations seem to predict that objects can exist in two different states at the same time, in two different locations, or in multiple different locations at the same time, which is pretty strange, and it's hard to make sense of in terms of objects at the ordinary scale. In fact, it is as though I've got a book on quantum mechanics that points this out. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's as though we've asked the question, if a tree falls in a forest and no one is there to see it fall, does it really fall? And we've got the wrong answer. Like science has come back to us and said, no, it doesn't fall. It's that kind of strange. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for this video. If you enjoyed this stuff, do give the video a like and consider subscribing to the channel. I'm going to be back with more of it approximately once a week, probably.